Taming the Bulldog? The Natural and the Pragmatic. Well, it's a long story, he said, but the question I would like to know is the ultimate question of life, the universe and everything. All we know about it is that the answer is 42, which is a little aggravating. Douglas Adams. Science has achieved much and will no doubt continue to do much more. As a prestigious discipline, the achievements of its greatest students, Copernican astronomy, Newtonian physics, Einsteinian mechanics, are deservedly included in the exalted feats of human history. Indeed, the evolutionary work of Charles Darwin is fully entitled to be mentioned in the same breath as these iconic endeavors. However, such accomplishments are often treated as if they have solved or hinted at some answers to enduring questions of humankind. How should we live? What is good and true? What is the meaning of life? While the pioneers of these scientific achievements usually appreciate the importance of their work, they also often recognize its limits, conceding that such discoveries tend to prompt as many new questions as provide new answers. They accept that there is no necessary or proportionate relation between intellectual originality and technological utility. What we now know is an entirely different matter from what we will now do with such knowledge. Unfortunately, despite their wisdom of many great scientists, other lesser lights are not so perspicacious. Some seek to suppress and subvert new ideas, afraid that they will undermine all that is held sacred and thereby wreak social havoc. The response to Galileo's ideas is one such familiar example. Others attempt to turn scientific success into normative guidance. With an eye to the main chance, such prognosticators and hangers-on want to see moral truth in scientific accomplishment. Darwin's work has been paid the dubious compliment of both responses. Both are mistaken. As much as the soapy Sams have wanted to trash and discredit his ideas, the Bulldogs have striven to base a whole political manifesto on them. Since its conceptual mapping by David Hume in 1739, the chasm between facts and value has remained wide and unbridgeable. Its abysmal floor is strewn with the mangled theories of those foolish enough to countenance such an ill-advised crossing. Quite simply, ethical mandates cannot be found in or gleaned from the biological facts of nature. Nevertheless, this has not deterred many commentators from turning Darwinian science into a kind of metaphysical ethics by synthesizing strict biological propositions with broader social behaviors. They cannot imagine a Darwinian world that does not have Darwinian purposes. The unifying goal of these so-called social Darwinians is to offer a prescriptive dimension for future human progress. The struggle between individuals and their environment becomes both the engine and engineer of good social organization. With friends like this, Darwin has little need of enemies. Indeed, even though the stalwart Bulldog Huxley defended Darwin against attacks from religion, even he later put Darwin to some very un-Darwinian uses. While it is wrong-headed to imagine that natured or inherited characteristics have no impact on people's lives, it seems equally untenable to avow that it is the dominant consideration, as many latter-day Huxleyians believe. Although they often couch them in technical language, their arguments are tantamount to elucidating some miraculous and, therefore, non-Darwinian designing hand at work. While there is nothing philosophically invalid in suggesting that the survival of the fittest is a worthy goal, this cannot be done under cover of evolutionary theory. In law as elsewhere, it simply has to be defended like any other moral or political theory. As a normative initiative, it cannot simply be posited as a fact of nature or as an uncontroversial extrapolation from such facts, because this assumes what is the major bone of contention in such an ethical and political inquiry. What counts as facts and nature are contested categories. In short, the road to ethical enlightenment cannot pass by way of Hume's chasm. In this chapter, I want to implore jurists to resist the Promethean impulse to put evolutionary theory and therefore nature in the service of a preferred social or ideological vision. In the first section, introduce the Huxleyan tendency to galvanize a political outlook with biological imperatives. The recent work of law and economics and law and biology scholars is introduced. In the second section, I utilize the bitter exchange between Ronald Dworkin and Richard Posner to highlight the failings of a pseudo-scientific approach to jurisprudence. Next, I canvass the different pragmatic perspectives on law and adjudication. The emphasis is on defending a more radical and thoroughgoing version of this popular turn to pragmatism. In the fourth section, I anticipate and answer some likely objections to my mode of pragmatism. In the final section, I make some tentative suggestions about how the common law might be used to deal with the pressing problem of homelessness. Throughout, I insist that, contrary to what many common law jurists maintain, and regardless of what they say that they maintain, the category of the natural is as contingent and contextual in law as it is in life and science generally. There is nothing less natural about the rapist or burglar than the lover or philanthropist, What is natural is humanly constructed and then imbued with normative and occasionally transcendent qualities that give it its place and purchase in the intellectual world. Nature holds no necessary or final answers to life's pressing challenges. In short, what is and is not useful is a local and pragmatic matter of Darwin and dogs. Although, like Wilberforce, Thomas Henry Huxley was a thoroughly 19th century man, his life followed a different Victorian trajectory. Born in 1825 to a large and relatively poor family, he lived to achieve great success and widespread popularity until his death in 1895. Despite his lack of formal education, he managed to become proficient in a range of subjects: science, history, philosophy, and German, and, with the help of his brother-in-law, secured a medical apprenticeship. With a scholarship to Charing Cross Hospital, he set out on a career that was take him both across various disciplines and up through the hierarchy of 19th century science. Having graduated in 1846 from London University with a gold medal for anatomy and physiology, Huxley entered the Royal Navy and worked as an assistant surgeon on the HMS Rattlesnake. In a parallel move to Darwin's own life path, his 4-year voyage took him through the South Seas, where he examined and collected an abundance of marine life, although, unfortunately, the ship's crew tossed many of his samples and equipment overboard. On the basis of this field work, Huxley published a series of highly respected papers on plant and animal morphology that established him as a special up-and-comer in the elite world of science. However, his personal situation remained precarious and, unlike the wealthy Wilberforce and Darwin, he struggled to make ends meet. He eventually secured a position at the School of Mines in London, which enabled him to continue his scientific endeavours and to bring his fiancée over from Sydney, Australia. By the time of the Oxford debate in 1860, Huxley was getting by and had acquired an excellent reputation as a careful, thorough, and sharp scientist, albeit one who was not afraid to rock the establishment boat. He was committed not only to highlighting the importance of scientific method as a moral and intellectual discipline, but also to urging the working classes to understand that science and her ways are great facts for them, that physical virtue is the base of all other, and that they are to be clean and temperate and all the rest, not because fellows in black with white ties tell them so, but because these are plain and patent laws of nature, which they must obey under penalties. As a result of his part in the infamous Oxford debate and his vigorous defense of Darwin's The Origin of Species generally, Huxley earned the sobriquet of Darwin's Bulldog. Although he retained his doubts about a number of aspects of Darwin's evolutionary theory, he espoused the general scientific cause against all comers. His commitment to the ideal of a meritocracy was combined with an almost pathological antipathy to aristocracy and privilege. Ironically, Huxley's professional pursuit of science was almost a religious crusade. In particular, Huxley was implacable in his rejection of any incipient creation by design argument. He believed the world to be a rational place and held that, by doubting everything until conclusively proved, one could gain complete insight into all aspects of the natural world. Any argument from design was treated as a theological claim that neglected the scientific duty to question and thus had to be rejected. For Huxley, the Cartesian method was an inviolable imperative for all scientists. Indeed, it was this skeptical rigor that obliged Huxley to query even the ideas of Darwin. Noting the lack of any genuine empirical evidence, ironically, much as Wilberforce had done, Huxley was unconvinced that Darwinian gradualism and natural selection were the last word on evolution because he thought that they smacked of a lingering creationist and progressionist mentality that should be resisted at all costs. He maintained, much to Darwin's chagrin, that there were persistent species that did not necessarily change by descent. Nevertheless, while he resisted the details of Darwin's account longer than the evidence warranted and never did fully accept that evolution was gradual rather than advancing by leaps or saltations, he did finally come to embrace Darwin's theory. Huxley did so with a vengeance that was entirely characteristic. By the end of his life, the younger Huxley had turned Darwin's distinctly biological thesis into a moral theory. Huxley was in the vanguard of a movement to put Darwin's ideas to normative effect in the maelstrom of Victorian politics. At first, Huxley toyed with the idea of a kind of bio-communism as was fashionable in the Europe of the 1880s. He soon moved on to more disturbing extrapolations. He saw that the facts of historical process did not constitute validity for moral conduct. Maintaining that inevitable struggle undermined any possibility of socialist cooperation, Huxley contended that society grows as so-called antisocial animal instincts are curbed and advances through the selection of individuals who are ethically the best, rather than physically the fittest. He envisaged a definite evolutionary hierarchy with humans at its head and having the capacity, if not always the inclination, to rise above and judge all else. With more bitter bombast than astute analysis, Huxley overplayed his Darwinian hand and, in a classic move typical of almost all social Darwinians, passed off personal preference as universal truth. Not content to lecture about moral decay and deliverance, Huxley inserted his views into political debate by recommending a nationalist agenda that made workforce training obligatory if England was to win the economic battle against the competing industrial powers of Europe. In short, Huxley could not resist the temptation to try and convert his scientific prestige into a harder political currency. The resulting social Darwinism turned science against socialism and instilled a dubious patriotism. As with many others, Huxley's efforts failed as both science and politics. Moreover, in the process, he had become more vicious Rottweiler than loyal Bulldog. Sadly, Huxley began a mode of Darwinian scholarship that has persisted to this day, the effort to underpin a particularized ethical or political outlook with biological imperatives and thereby render it somehow more legitimate and compelling. While the major thrust of this social Darwinian tendency has been to promote a Christian laissez-faire mentality and capitalist mode of organization, there have been other attempts to utilize Darwinian ideas in more socialistic endeavors. Indeed, it has been Darwin's blessing and blight that his work has been put to work in the service of such a wide range of normative projects. The price of popular acceptance has been the cost of ideological perversion. The fact is that there is both too little and too much in Darwinian evolution to warrant any reliance on it in ethical or political debate. It offers too little in that it was never intended to provide more than a descriptive account of organic development. It provides no assistance to those who want to predict what will happen next, let alone what should happen next. However, when it is imported into ethical or political study, it suggests too much in that almost all behavior can be seen to have a tenuous connection to some biological feature. Even if there are genetically favored behavioral traits, they are not only insufficiently specific to be of much predictive or practical use but also as likely to result in different behaviors in different contexts. Nevertheless, neither this conceptual barrier nor the tortured history to get over it has prevented a whole host of faux Darwinians from turning evolutionary science into its own religion or ideology. While Huxley's own offering might be considered to be ill-advised and wrong-headed, the appeal of his overall project is as enticing today as it ever was. This is no better evidenced than in the arcane world of jurisprudential scholarship, where predictability and explicability continue to be erroneously treated as synonymous. The ghost of Huxley still does battle with Wilberforce's phantom for the soul of the contemporary jurist. As part of the continuing effort in law to give scholarship and policy-making prescriptive clout, some commentators have turned to evolutionary science for guidance and support. While they continue a long empirical tradition that began with Holmes and others, these contemporary theorists claim to be more sophisticated and modest in their ambitions. However, although they are more polished and professional in their presentations, they are no less ambitious and no more successful in their pursuits than the original Bulldog in striving to derive an ought from an is. Although it comes in many versions and operates on many different fronts, the law and economics field has appropriated the evolutionary theme in its attempts to explain the development of the common law. This reliance on Darwinian themes is subtle and indirect, but no less significant and acknowledged for that. Borrowing from systems theory and relying on econometric modeling, it is contended that most legal behavior can be explained in terms of the evolutionary drive toward efficient outcomes. In particular, these scholars argue that the common law evolves toward efficient rules for a variety of reasons, including judges' propensity to favor efficient rules, the greater likelihood that inefficient rules will be litigated, and the greater frequency of court settlement in cases in which the legal rules relevant to the dispute are inefficient for them. Past decisions, whether intended, contingent, or accidental, not only do affect or constrain present judicial making, but also should do so. There is a gamble, or more a fix, that what has been done has a redeeming moral or political worth. Insofar as these modern law and economic efforts seek to identify a defining normative thread to law's historical development and then discipline present efforts in line with it, they are actually doing much the same as the reviled creationists. The only difference is that the one does this at a disguised scientific step removed from the miraculous design thesis of the other. A more overt incorporation of Darwinian evolutionary themes occurs in the growing body of work by the so-called law and biology scholars. The modern phase retreats from an explicit directedness to legal development, stressing the evolutionary nature of complex social behaviors such as morality or altruism. It seeks to incorporate evolutionary understandings of biology into a model of the development of law. Since law itself is a mode of social behavior acted out by and on human animals, it is maintained that biological insight should provide better tools to understand and regulate that behavior. There are at least three ways in which evolutionary biology can illuminate socio-legal analysis: predicting patterns of behavior, clarifying the contours of socio-legal values, and suggesting possible means toward achieving identified social goals. The basic argument is that evolution has not only developed people's brains but also biased them in certain behavior-influencing ways so that people do not act in random or unpredictable ways. Over time, environmental challenges have been met by a variety of human responses, and it is those genetically disposed forms of behaviors that have permitted or advanced genetic survival that have now become dominant. While evolution favors reproductively helpful traits, it does not create them, it simply picks the best possible among the available choices. In such an account, evolution is about strategic fitness, not theoretical perfection. Problems do generate solutions, even if they are often imperfect. Armed with this knowledge about the interaction of genes and environment, law and biology scholars claim that the effort to design laws will be improved and become more efficacious when such biological insights are understood. As one enthusiast has boldly put it, behavioral biology, like economics, helps lawyers with both the is and ought dimensions of an issue. Consequently, these scholars hope that, by grounding law in an evolutionary account that emphasizes that there are certain shared genetic functions and capacities that predispose humans to certain behavior in particular contexts, many of the philosophical and practical problems that paralyze much mainstream jurisprudence can be sidestepped. These evolutionary accounts make several significant and erroneous assumptions in seeking to convert biological insights into a normative jurisprudence, that minute changes in biological causes bring about minute changes in behavioral effects, that simple patterns of behavior ground predictable outcomes, that complex systems can be understood by breaking them down into simple and separate components, and that exceptional behavior proves the systemic applicability of general rules. However, the fact is that systems combine and interact in such a complex and dynamic way that small variations on any one side of these social equations can result in large changes on the other side of the equation. For example, small changes in biological causes can wreak large changes in behavioral effects. The behavioral whole can be very different from the sum of the individual behaviors, and small variations in social context can produce very different behavioral responses. While the mind itself may be a product of natural selection, it does not follow that particular patterns of behavior are. It is simply not possible to isolate satisfactorily whether particular behavioral traits are the product of natural or nurtured tendencies and at what point any so-called natural tendency is re-nurtured. However, rather than pursue these criticisms generally, I will situate them in a focused and continuing debate that goes to the heart of modern jurisprudence, the battle royal between Ronald Dworkin and Richard Posner. The comparisons between this exchange and that between Wilberforce and Huxley almost 150 years ago are striking, not least because Dworkin and Posner not only resemble their historical antecedents but also think that they are more fundamentally dissimilar than they are. Some of the lessons to be learned from this bitter contemporary exchange are that bulldogs are sometimes only soapy Sams in canine clothing, and that bulldogs sometimes bite the hand that feeds them. When Ronnie met Dick, although the venue has been suitably ubiquitous in this technological age, the occasion for much of the furious and dyspeptic exchanges between Dworkin and Posner was the antics of President Clinton and the validity of unsuccessful efforts to impeach him. However, like the Oxford debate between Wilberforce and Huxley, the agenda is much broader and more polarized. It pits the established legal order, with its metaphysics, against a social scientific paradigm. Ronald Dworkin, Pragmatism, is philosophically a dog's dinner. Richard Posner, I take it, Dworkin, does not much like dogs. Ronald Dworkin, as it happens, I like dogs very much. Richard Posner, as a cat person, I am disappointed. I hope I will be forgiven for having thought him distinctly feline. Beneath, or perhaps above, the personal invective and collateral point scoring, there is a very significant dispute over the nature and legitimacy of common law adjudication. In opposition to Soapy Sam Dworkin's frankly theological rendering of the jurisprudential project, Bulldog Posner offers a more pragmatic and scientific challenge that eschews all attempts to relate the worth of grand theory to the practical operation of the adjudicative task. The law is less a theological pilgrimage of legal faith and more a technical craft of bureaucratic policy making. While there is something to admire in each of these positions, there is much more to reject. Whereas Posner is a typical lawyer who cannot resist turning the powerful descriptive thrust of Darwinian evolution to illegitimate prescriptive effect, Dworkin rejects entirely the critical force of evolutionary theory and reveals that he is more the creationist than he might otherwise think or wish to be. It will be remembered that, for Dworkin, adjudication is a philosophical adventure of the grandest kind in which formal integrity and abstract coherence are both the tools and goal of intrepid jurists. Combining ethical optimism and evolutionary inevitability, Dworkin glosses the messy, episodic, and self-correcting workings of the common law as a polished, integrated, and teleological process. Many lawyers and jurists reject such scholarly spiritualism and its claims that law has a miraculous suprahistorical life. Even if such an approach were once viable, it is increasingly untenable in a contemporary world in which lawyers and society at large are increasingly diverse in composition, interests, and objectives. In contrast, pragmatic critics argue that common law adjudication is much more earthly, less preposterous, and thoroughly practical in aspiration and execution. They maintain that Dawkins' plea for a justificatory assent to some abstract remove from which it might be possible to catch an echo of the infinitely true and carry it back to society for people's edification and enlightenment is exactly the wrong trip to take. For them, not only is there no escape from the messy and contingent facts of social living in history, but there also ought to be no fear or disappointment on realizing that fact. The most prominent of these pragmatic critics is, of course, Richard Posner. Once a firm believer himself in the truths of objectivity and integrity, he has now put his prodigious energy at the service of a more pragmatic creed. He has become, like Huxley, a Darwinian Rottweiler who can only be ignored at all lawyers' and jurists' peril. Posner argues that moral theory not only has little to offer law but that it is positively dangerous to its actual operation. For him, a Dawkinian pilgrimage takes judges and jurists off into the kind of ideological and indeterminate speculation that is inimical to legitimate lawyering. Drawing explicitly on the writings of several neo-Darwinians and in the evolutionary wake of his intellectual hero, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., Posner recommends an adaptationist conception of morality, in which morality is judged, non-morally, in the way that a hammer might be judged well or poorly adapted to its function of hammering nails, by its contribution to the survival, or other goals, of a society. In this way, Posner maintains that judges can act as evolutionary midwives by facilitating rather than steering society's moral development and progress. For Posner, this does not mean that law must be unprincipled or technocratic, only that it is wrong to equate moral principle to principle, and morality to normativity. Instead, he concludes that what is required is that judges develop a disposition to ground policy judgments on facts and consequences than on conceptualisms and generalities. In short, judges and lawyers must eschew moral philosophy for social science. In fulfilling this bureaucratic role, judges and jurists, Posner recommends, should avail themselves of the economist's empirical tools and work to craft useful solutions to pressing and practical controversies. While there is much to appreciate in Posner's pragmatic critique of Dawkinian-style theorizing, this audacious proposal, that the empirical tools of economists are morally neutral and ought to be adopted by judges, is no less troubling. Indeed, like the earlier Bulldog, Posner manages to subvert Darwinian ideas in the process of championing them. He turns a valid descriptive analysis into an illegitimate prescriptive theory. At the end of the day, by replacing moral philosophy with social science, he is in the same theological game as Dawkins. It is not simply that he tells society what it should do if it wants to be a better society, which is a fine and noble enterprise, but that he does so in the name of science. While it is true that judges and jurists would do well to take greater heed of the socio-political context in which they work and of the actual consequences of their decisions and suggestions, it is absurd to imagine that this can be done without some resort to social values or political commitments. As an empirical matter, it is simply not the case that there is a fair degree of value consensus among the judges, such that they can seek the best results unhampered by philosophical doubts. What theory cannot do, whether in an ethical or scientific guise, is provide a method that will relieve people from the responsibility and challenge of constantly arguing and re-arguing what should and should not be done in particular contexts at particular times. Indeed, like many others before him, Posner fails to grasp that there are no secure footings for law and legal theory that are not themselves part of the very political and situated debate that they are intended to ground. Dawkins is surely right when he argues that Posner's claims about the political process are not descriptive or technical, they are moral in the sense that they are not only judgments about how best to achieve stipulated goals but also highly controversial claims about the distribution and exercise of government powers and the limits imposed by respect for individual moral rights. Posner calls for the death of moral theory, but, like all of philosophy's would-be undertakers, he only means the triumph of his own theory. While it is perfectly appropriate to chastise Posner for drawing on values, it does not mean that this commits such a critique to the theological kind of grand theorizing in which soapy Sams specialize. Espousing the merits of survival of the fittest or a related pseudo-biological standard is less of a problem than the attempt to defend it as an evolutionary imperative. Debate over such proposals is a distinctly moral and, therefore, endlessly controversial engagement rather than an exercise in scientific demonstration. A sound defense of any moral theory need not entail the kind of abstract and pure speculation that Dawkins urges. For example, He seems to be insisting that there is no choice other than objective truth, a matter of how things really are, or subjective opinion, in our own breasts. Anything that does not live up to the objective standards of truth is mere conviction, mere convention, mere ideology, and so on. This kind of either-or, all or nothing thinking misrepresents the possibilities. To be against objective truth does not mean that one is left with only subjective opinion. To be against only subjective opinion does not imply that one is defending the existence of objective truth. Although the traditional search for objectivity is a lost cause, there are not only subjective opinions and relativized truths. Instead, one truth is not as good as another, if one understands by truth nothing more than that it meets the familiar procedures of justification that hold sway. It is not about striving to reach a promised land of truth that will make further justification unnecessary. Instead, jurisprudence must become more useful such that success is not vouchsafed by reliance on a particular epistemic method, but by the usefulness of the results arrived at and their effect on meeting certain objectives that are taken to be morally or politically significant. Moral choice is always a matter of compromise between competing goods rather than a choice between the absolutely right and the absolutely wrong. Accordingly, instead of reflecting with the soapy Sams upon universality to justify particular principles, which will turn out anyway as little more than a cover for the theorist's own political or moral agenda, there should be talk along with Posner about the concrete and relative advantages of choosing one over another. However, such talk must be openly moral and political, since there is no scientific or factual way to finesse that responsibility and opportunity. Sadly, Posner is pragmatic in the most unpragmatic of ways. Because he accepts much of the contextual situation as given, he restricts himself to tinkering with present arrangements and remains profoundly abstruse and rationalistic in his analysis. Abstract universality is ditched, only to be replaced with abstract particularity. There is little appreciation that legal reasoning operates in the real world of historical struggle or of how law does, and does not, change. When the idea of social practices is given a more political than ethical spin, the operation of power is brought into the center of debate. Consensus, and, therefore, standards of persuasion and justification, can be treated as imposed as much as chosen. In moving from truth to usefulness, a thoroughly pragmatic jurisprudence does not set out to know things as they really are a la the soapy Sams or to isolate a scientific criterion of usefulness a la the Bulldogs. In responding to the compelling question of what to do next, both a soapy Sam Dawkins and a Bulldog Posner answer with far too much certainty or confidence than is good for them or anyone else. Knowledge and usefulness are not the stable or secure footings on which the houses of law can be safely constructed. A Darwinian-informed pragmatism is much less modest and much more experimental. In Darwinian terms, law is only one more set of tools through which human beings are struggling to cope with the contingent circumstances of their environment and with the realization that these efforts, like the best-laid plans of Robbie Burns' Mice and Men, often come to naught. It was Justice Brandeis' prediction that little progress in society will made until the lawyer's obsession with the logic of words has been healed by their attachment to the logic of realities. However, in emphasizing that law's development is better explained as a contingent responsiveness to historical circumstances than as the unfolding of law's inner logic, I ought not to be taken to be making the very different claim that law develops in line with some external deep logic of social reality. It is logic as much as the words or the realities that is the problem. There is no one account of the organic relation between law and social relations that is valid for all time, all societies, and all legal developments. The connections between legal doctrine and material interests are often as casual as they are causal and as contingent as they are necessary. It is not that legal doctrine is without any rhyme or reason at all, but that any efforts to go beyond either the most general or the most detailed account are confounded by the doctrinal and social facts. The explanations become either so abstract as to lack any practical predictive force or so elaborate as to capture only a particular historical moment in time. There are always too many plausible and competing rationales to satisfy the formalistic need for explanatory primacy or closure. In the same way that E.P. Thompson announced that the greatest of all fictions is that the law evolves, from case to case, by its own impartial logic, true only to its own integrity, unswayed by expedient considerations, the reverse can be proclaimed with equal force. Law does not evolve, from case to case, by the partial logic of class struggle, true only to established interests, unswayed by logical considerations. By different measures at different times, the development of law is a mix of the logical, in the sense of attempted compliance with law's own generated, and indeterminate, rationality, and the expedient, in the sense of responsiveness to society's own political, and indeterminate, demands. Both logic and expediency infiltrate and affect the operation of each other. Lawyers and judges are neither only the lackey of established, or any other, interests nor always the intellectual captives of a professional tradition. Whereas Dawkins' naturalism emphasizes the logical at the expense of the expedient, Posner's pragmatism passes off the expedient as the logical. This all having been said, it is not my intention to condemn theory tout court. It should be clear that I am not against theory per se but only its continued and exclusive black-letter self-image. A sophisticated anti-theory is not same as a vulgar anti-theoreticism or a crude practicalism. I am against grand theory and theoreticism, not theory or philosophy. If intellectuals are to be of use to societies that claim or aspire to democratic ideals, then they must abandon the belief that their task must be to lay down authoritative blueprints for legal and political action in the name of some universal truth about the human condition or law. It is not only possible but also more effective to talk about politics and morality without a commitment to a theory of objective truths. An emancipatory or transformative project does not depend on or require a grand theory to back it up. In the same way that there is no sharp break between theory and practice, so too is there no gap between law and politics or between jurisprudence and practical lawyering. It is not that each collapses into the other and has no relevant differences, but that there is no bright line dividing one from the other that is not itself hostage to the context in which it arises and is sustained. In an important sense, it is more theory that is needed, not less. I agree with Dawkins that we have no choice but to ask judges and lawyers to confront issues that, from time to time, are philosophical. However, I also maintain that such philosophical work need not and must not be of the abstract variety that he recommends. Dawkins' jurisprudence does not so much abandon all the familiar legal phlogistons, as he claims, but in its attachment to integrity, truth, and objectivity adds to the alchemical collection. Instead, what is required is a more useful jurisprudence. In the end, there must be talk about substance without the distracting diversion of talk about theory, not, however, as Posner and his dog-loving friends insist, as an exercise without values, or, more accurately, as values presented as facts, and not, as Dawkins and his soapy colleagues insist, as a matter of grand theorizing. It is to a more useful and emancipatory account of legal theory that I now turn toward a useful jurisprudence. As will be obvious to anyone vaguely familiar with the contemporary jurisprudential scene, pragmatism has become very much the derided intellectual fashion of the day. While it is not quite accurate to report that every jurist announces that we are all pragmatists now, there is a definite desire on the part of many jurists to be identified with the pragmatic turn in legal theory. In many ways, this is an encouraging trend. However, on closer inspection, it becomes clear that these conversions are more superficial than real, more a simple change of clothes than a substantial transformation of lifestyle. Many of those who call themselves pragmatists have done little more than incorporate pragmatic phrasings and vocabulary into their jurisprudential writings. Like Posner, they still subscribe to the same traditional understanding of the jurisprudential project and what would count as its successful completion. In short, they practice pragmatism in the most unpragmatic of ways and deploy pragmatic means for distinctly unpragmatic ends. Accordingly, it is fitting to chart the different forms of jurisprudential pragmatism in terms of their willingness to pursue the full implications of a pragmatic sensibility. There seem to be three possible groupings: conservative, liberal, and radical. Whereas the first two hedge on the implications of a pragmatic critique, the third carries through that critique in the most uncompromising way. However, while I support a radical pragmatism, I do not do so because it is the best or only form of pragmatic jurisprudence. That would smack too much of a theological standard, and I would run the risk of the buying into the so-called naturalistic fallacy. Instead, I do so simply because it presently seems to offer the most useful and effective possibility for improving the lot of those most disadvantaged and disenfranchised in contemporary industrialized society. It is a pragmatically open and distinctly political claim. The three kinds of pragmatism can be summarized as follows. Conservative pragmatism is conservative because, as the name implies, it accepts much of the contextual situation as given. There is no willingness to disturb present arrangements. In jurisprudence, conservative pragmatists propose a pragmatic mode of legal reasoning that rejects the theoretical pretensions of the grand theorists and treasures the virtues of technical craft and particularized judgment. While its practitioners make all the right noises, their accounts remain profoundly abstruse and rationalistic in the sense that they are unsituated in the material circumstances of history and inured to their political dynamics. There is little appreciation that legal reasoning operates in a real world of historical struggle or of how law does change. The only experience and context that matters is the legal one. The experience of the law is the life of its own logic. Liberal pragmatism is much less insulated and contained than conservative pragmatism. The whole idea and force of contingency is given much greater recognition. Stepping outside the hermetic world of legal experience, scholars look to legal reasoning as a much more constructed and contextualized practice. Under this view, law and jurisprudence are a language game that people play with greater or lesser facility. It is as much a matter of coping as it is of getting it right. Although many follow the conventional script, some struggle to escape from inherited descriptions and to offer fresh discursive options. Truth and objectivity are ethical practices that are not about the accurate representation of something non-human, but a matter of intersubjective consensus among human beings. As ethical ideals, transformation and emancipation are treated as more a personal undertaking than a social project. The emphasis is on private salvation rather than public reconstruction. Last, but not least, there is radical pragmatism. In contrast to both conservative and liberal pragmatism, it does not hedge on the subversive implications of the anti-essentialist insight. In a manner of speaking, radical pragmatism is radical because it accepts that it is pragmatism all the way down. There is no artificial distinction between what is and is not up for grabs. Because everything has been constructed, everything can be deconstructed and reconstructed. If conservative pragmatism ignores both history and politics, liberal pragmatism has succeeded in placing present arrangements in a historical context, only to fail to politicize that history. Liberal pragmatism tends to apprehend more benign and accidental forces at work in social life than is the case in law. This means that legal reasoning is as much about political oppression as it is about ethical consensus. The liberal pragmatist's failure to appreciate adequately the grubby, materialistic, and public conditions under which private efforts at self-realization take place makes their notion of political struggle too clinical, too intellectual, and too individualistic. Accordingly, by refusing to duck the corrosive consequences of a thoroughgoing pragmatism, the radical version ensures that what amounts to a useful politics or jurisprudence is opened up to the widest range of possible options and, what is most important, to the widest range of participants. By giving the idea of social practices a more political than ethical spin, it brings the operation of power into the center of debate, consensus, and, therefore, standards of persuasion and justification, can as easily be treated as imposed as much as chosen. Careful not to slip back into a discredited version of ideological suffocation, such a radical pragmatism can thereby work toward ensuring that those voices presently left out of democracy's sustaining conversation are included and able to articulate for themselves what is and is not useful for them. I say for themselves because it is the lingering influence of a foundationalist hubris that mistakenly suggests that the educated and wise can speak best for the dispossessed. Instead, public and local efforts at transformation must be undertaken to permit the disenfranchised to speak in their own voices, with their own vocabulary, and through their own visions about usefulness. However, the voices of the presently excluded should not be valorized or given authority simply by virtue of their excludedness. Democracy demands neither the demonization nor the romanticization of the oppressed. Moreover, as well as broadening and substantiating the popular franchise, there must be equally vigorous efforts to multiply and transform the institutions in which debate and struggle occur. A radical society is not one that has a fixed idea of usefulness or a set inventory of institutional opportunities for its elaboration. It is one in which the idea and institutions of usefulness are themselves being constantly revisited and revised. There is nothing about this plea for such a robustly democratic society that depends on any philosophical claim that such a society is more natural, more rational, more coherent, more pure, or more anything else than any other society. On the contrary, it is simply a substantive argument that such a society is best suited to ensure the emancipation of people from suffering and deprivation. As a political and topical proposal, it is defended and espoused in the name of usefulness, not truth. In this radical view of pragmatism, the democratic ideal of a free and open encounter about values and commitments is to be encouraged. But that freedom and openness cannot be understood outside some context of power and politics. While there is no truth or reason to set over against power or politics, it does not follow that one simply collapses into the other. Those critics who argue that reason is only power are as mistaken as those who argue that reason and power can be totally insulated from each other. Although truth and reason are always located within a context of power and politics, the possibility of maintaining standards of justification and persuasion is not thereby sabotaged entirely. Rather than attempt the impossible by seeking to establish standards that are pure and undistorted by power, efforts should be taken to make standards more shared and to include the widest possible diversity of voices in their social construction. The claim to establish neutral or objective standards is fated to reflect the ideas, no matter how well intentioned, of a select few. Indeed, Because judgments of merit are inevitably culturally and ideologically contingent, an unbiased standard is simply one that does not favor one group over other. It is not one that is supposedly based on no values at all. Indeed, the problem is not the intervention of power in the halls of reason, but the traditional belief that power can be somehow excluded and that there exists some non-cultural and non-social standard of merit. The democratic ambition is not to ensure that reason is detached from value or power, but that the values and interests that help constitute reason represent and are conducive to a truly democratic society. The debate must be about what counts as reason and merit and what standards are most useful to a democratic society. Accordingly, a meritocratic ideal is not anti-democratic, provided that what is understood as meritorious is a situated and substantive assessment, not a formal and far-fetched one. In a similar vein, a radical brand of pragmatism insists that, although any accommodation to the status quo is not required, its root and branch rejection is not demanded. Being opportunistic rather than doctrinaire, those committed to significant transformation should be prepared to use whatever resources are available to them, on the basis that no strategy has any necessary or inevitable consequences, but will depend on the particular context in which it is utilized. Radicals should be prepared to draw on the conservative and liberal repertoire to advance the cause of democratic empowerment. Because the present is the only place to begin the making of a better future, it is appropriate to utilize existing institutional arrangements at the same time that one works to effect their transformation in line with a more progressive and emancipatory ideal. To allow the ideal future to be the enemy of the flawed present is a recipe for resignation and complicity, not action and change. Ideological purity is no more attractive or useful than its philosophical relative. In short, because everything is constructed, it does not mean that everything has to be deconstructed or reconstructed all at once. The fact that everything is up for grabs does not demand that everything be up or grabbed at the same time. One way to advance that useful agenda might be to treat the courts and common law as venues for the resolution of concrete disputes rather than as the site for the philosophical elaboration of doctrinal integrity or conceptual purity. While the courts have been a privileged site for defending the status quo, and the history of the common law is more reactionary than revolutionary, radical pragmatists should countenance litigation as a possible tool for social change if or when the local conditions are propitious. This may demand a shift in jurisprudential emphasis from the law-making focus of judges to their problem-solving capacity. Indeed, despite their protestations to the contrary, Dawkins and his soapy colleagues do not take law seriously. By asking judges to be open to justificatory assent and thereby turning them into grand theorists, they neglect the pragmatic strengths of the common law and reduce politics to an abstract pursuit. The potential strength of the common law is its practicality and situatedness. The courts must concentrate more on practical solutions to practical problems than on philosophical responses to philosophical problems. It is not so much that a pragmatic account of the common law facilitates or frustrates particular political interventions, but that it neither forecloses nor guarantees their success. Again, in proposing this juristic realignment, I ought not to be taken as suggesting that the common law has been or necessarily can be the preferred complement to this kind of useful approach to jurisprudence. However, I do maintain that, when viewed from such a pragmatic perspective, the common law might be used as an institutional site for experimental, contextualized, and practical interventions to advance certain political initiatives. While the history of the common law ought not to impress the critic's sensibilities, resort to the courts need not be a hopeless or counterproductive diversion. Within such a revisioning of the common law, jurists and legal scholars can play a number of roles. Foremost among them is that no study of law or ethics should be done, as Blackletterism proposes, without recognizing the political context and conditions of that undertaking. The resilient blackletter practice of decontextualization must be strenuously combated. Instead, there has to be a greater recognition that law and politics are intimately and inseparably related. It is futile and well-nigh fraudulent to study one without the other. However, the study of politics and its relationship to law is not enough in itself. That study must be done in such a way that avoids the pitfalls and problems of blackletterism. There is little point in examining law's political context and determinants if it is done within the capacious reach but narrowing influence of a formalistic mindset. To demand anything less is to allow the lingering spirit of blackletterism to intoxicate people into believing that clear directions and speedy routes can be mapped onto the messy and changing terrain of ethical and political inquiry, especially in mapping and exploring the relation of law and politics. Although the useful kind of legal scholarship recommended is scarce, it is not entirely absent. There is exciting work being done by, and this should come as no surprise, women and people of color. For instance, in the English context, for every Smith and Hogan, there is a Lacey and Wells; for every Tritell and Beatson, there is a Wheeler and Shaw; and for every Salmond and Street, There is O'Connor and Mansell. In particular, in contrast to Smith and Hogan's scholarship, the feminist-inspired work of Nicola Lacey and Celia Wells is a breath of fresh air. They are truly interdisciplinary, making explicit their operative assumptions, moving socially relevant issues from margin to center, and focusing on the theoretical in the best practical sense. As a complement to the work of such legal scholars, jurists can also play an explicitly and suitably theoretical role. Apart from tackling the lingering influence and fundamentalist practice of mainstream theory, they can bring fresh insights and appreciations to jurisprudence. In particular, jurists can develop alternative modes of discourse, so that philosophy will become more a discourse of dissent than a monologue of reverence. Rather than draft grand schema for political or legal action under the authority of some alleged universal truth, philosophers can seek out new possibilities and alternative openings. By cultivating the ability to redescribe the familiar in unfamiliar terms, such useful theorists can help dislodge the deep-seated belief that present socio-historical arrangements are inevitable and frozen in place. They can reassure people that, once epistemology has lost authority, mob rule will not fill the theoretical void. But empowered citizens might and, in doing so, can begin to claim authority over their own lives and participate more effectively in the civic elaboration of situated truths. By being activist in imagination and commitment, pragmatists may come to recognize that their philosophical task is to be as much inspired poets as robust political operatives. Or, to put it another way, jurists will recognize that the best way to do legal philosophy is to do it pragmatically, usefully, and poetically. The persistent belief that law is the calling of thinkers, whether in the form of metaphysicians or economists, and not the place for the artist or the poet, is to be discarded once and for all. Like similar formalistic distinctions, the difference between art and science or literature and philosophy is one of emphasis and practice, not essence and theory. In becoming more artistic and poetic, jurists and legal scholars can also become better legal thinkers and political policy makers. Radical charges. An important charge against useful jurisprudence, and my radical version of it, is likely to be that, although I urge a more useful performance of the jurisprudential craft, I am engaged in exactly the same kind of indulgent word-mongering that is typical of the traditional philosophical mindset. Withdrawn from the real world, I am long on words and short on action. How many more people will be off the streets and in better accommodation as a result of this book? It might be suggested that, if I am true to my own critique, I must entirely abandon a commitment to legal philosophy and simply dedicate myself to political action. Otherwise, I run the risk of hypocrisy and possible complicity in the very project that I condemn. There are several responses to this. First, while there is much wisdom in this criticism, its force is more cautionary than condemnatory. I cannot disagree that it would be better if there were more political activists and fewer legal theorists. However, this does not mean that legal theorists have no role to play at all, only that it should be a more humble and limited one that receives far less kudos than it presently does. Second, as a legal theorist, I hope to be doing something useful in that I am challenging the way that jurists and legal scholars tend to turn all practical problems into philosophical ones, thereby unhelpfully representing them as abstract puzzles rather than substantive problems. In contrast, I urge those involved in legal study to abjure such flights of fancy and to keep their feet firmly on the social ground, even as that ground shifts and changes with time and circumstance. It is situation sense that is best cultivated, not conceptual sophistication. However, the obvious riposte to this defense is that being a legal theorist, of whatever color or commitment, is the real problem. Even if the talk is about usefulness, it remains only talk and ignores the main lesson of a radical pragmatic critique, that it is better to live a life of beneficent activity than talk about living one. Good intentions do little in themselves to alleviate suffering and cruelty. This is a stiff challenge and must be confronted directly. My third and more fundamental response, therefore, is to return to the basic thrust of a radical pragmatism and, in particular, its opposition to more traditional philosophical jurisprudence. The insistence on a hard and fast distinction between talk and actions is not as real or as compelling as some might think. Moreover, it is made no less palatable because it is deployed in the service of a more so-called progressive agenda. Such a contrast between words and acts, like all other distinctions, that is, theory and practice, law and politics, etc., is difficult to maintain in a post-theological world. Indeed, to treat talk and action as conceptually distinct is a hallmark of the kind of thinking that I have sought to discredit. The practical power of ideas or talk is not something to be underestimated. After all, without talk and ideas, it is difficult to imagine how it would be possible to identify the problems of contemporary jurisprudence and move beyond them. Moreover, in the broader context of social history, It is talk of ideas as much as acts of force that helps to hold oppressive regimes in place and that can contribute to their downfall. Both Vorster's and Mandela's career as well as Hitler's and Churchill's testify to that. What counts as a problem and what should be done about it implicates some theoretical assumption. Similarly, what tells one to act instead of only talk is itself a theoretical premise. Of course, what I mean by theoretical is not something to be set over, against, or above practice. It is part and parcel of the same enterprise. In a manner of speaking, talk is an act that, while it might not be as immediate or as obvious as Molotov's, is as necessary to what we do as anything else. In the same way that there are better and worse ways of acting, so there are better and worse ways of talking. Accordingly, there is no one way to challenge injustice. It takes many people doing many different things at many different times and in many different ways. Doing legal theory is one of those ways, no intrinsically better and no worse than any other ambition. But, as I have sought to argue, there are more useful and less useful ways of doing legal theory. My genuinely pragmatic perspective is more useful than either Dawkins or Posner's jurisprudence. Theory is an act that makes possible their acts, or, to put it more pragmatically, theory is itself a contextualized practice that is also one of the contexts within which acts take on shape and substance. Any theory's success at doing that will be a measure of its usefulness. Such a measure will be situated in substantive, not abstract and conceptual. Pontificating from a soapy pulpit or barking with a bulldog accent are ways that stand to do as much harm as good. It is not possible to tread a safe path into, through, and out of partisan politics. Not only will principled argument not be equal to the task, but it also might occasionally be a hindrance. Standing on principle is simply another way of sitting on some substantive ground and pretending that it is more solid and independent than it actually is. Indeed, being partisan is not the problem. It is what one is partisan about that is the only real issue worth caring or complaining about. Indeed, a large part of my critique is intended to encourage judges and jurists to be more politically candid and to drop the intellectual pretense that a principled stance has merit, regardless of the substantive content of that principle, and that it can lead to enlightenment or universal justice. There is no big plan and anyone offering one should be immediately suspect. There are only situation-specific and contingent commitments that continually change in substance and recommendation. However, it has been suggested that such a critical pragmatism is politically weak and falsely optimistic in that it lacks prescriptive bite. It offers no substantive guidelines for what counts as progressive change and, even when it does, these substantive positions amount to little more than personal and therefore unreliable commitments. While I am not unsympathetic to such chagrin, this way of thinking is symptomatic of much jurisprudential thinking on both the left and the right. To suggest that there are no reliable or enduring substantive guidelines is not equivalent to conceding that politics is only a world of naked preferences in which might is the only source of right. This is part of the very monochromatic view of the world that I reject. A critical pragmatic approach is neither cynical nor naive. In recommending the virtues of engaged and situated exchange, it entirely rejects the worth of a writer's-might stance, whether it is enthusiastically embraced or resignedly conceded. The critical pragmatists offer reasons, but eschew reason and pursue particular values but dismiss generalisms. In its plea for more, not less, debate, it is a put-up or shut-up approach that is intended to flush out the pretentious and pusillanimous. In the spirit of a critical and pragmatic perspective, I maintain that principle and substance go hand in hand in that each informs as it is informed by the other. Preferences are principles, not principles of the neutral kind but principles of the only kind there really are, strong moral intuitions as to how the world should go combined with a resolve to be faithful to them. There is no neutral or principled method that will deliver a legal truth independent of political exchange. That is why this pragmatic attack on principle is slightly more conducive to the left than to the right, at least insofar as the left can be understood to consist of those who are more generally committed to challenging existing institutional values than revering them. Of course, I do not make these claims as a matter of principle. I simply claim that, while nothing will or must follow from this kind of critique, something might follow depending on the particular practical context in which the critique is made and political action is taken. Of course, under different conditions and in different ways, the left might well be called to task when it cannot resist the temptation to enroll universal principle in defense of its political commitments, but that is more because the old-style left too often fails to recognize that what is progressive is itself contextual and always open to revision. There is no right approach to particular problems outside of their historical and political milieu, and, because there is no context of contexts, there is no easy, pat, uncontroversial, neutral, or exclusively principled way to decide what to do. Accordingly, Moral or political improvement is simply about closing the gap between particular aspirations and contingent actuality so that the world can become a relatively better place. It is about taking a critical and pragmatic approach to the constant responsibility to do what is best in the circumstances. In making this plea for a more useful jurisprudence, I ought not to be taken as part of the mainstream chorus for a shift in legal theory and scholarship. Although some maintain that the past 20 years have been a golden age for legal scholarship, others have argued strenuously that it has been a lamentable phase in which practical relevance has been sacrificed to theoretical indulgence. For instance, Justice Posner of the Supreme Court of Canada urges a move away from the kind of analytical legal theory that functions in terms of abstract, logically coherent, formal conceptual systems and promotes stability and coherent changeability by affecting the substantive content of rights and by providing a rational basis for judicial decision-making. He laments such a preoccupation on 3 grounds. First, he maintains that such a jurisprudential perspective presupposes a metaphysically untenable idea of objective moral truth. Second, he highlights the fact that such theorizing is impractical in that it does not sufficiently attend to what works in real life. Third, he contends that legal theory does not accurately describe what judges actually do when they reason through cases. By way of conclusion, he also points out that adjudication is pluralistic in that it concerns itself with more than legal theory and is guided by a search for the correct balance of all relevant factors. While it ought to be more relevant and less sophisticated, the general aim is for legal academics to act as helpmates to the courts so that they can develop areas of the law in a technically sound and substantively fair way. Academic commentary that is useful to judges is that which assembles and rationalizes judicial decisions in a given field of law, draws out the general principles that these decisions imply, criticizes judicial decisions and suggests different approaches to particular areas of law. There is much to admire in Posner's dismissal of analytical jurisprudence with its precious emphasis on abstraction and its overweening respect for coherence. However, there is little reason to believe that Posner's alternative has more to recommend it. Indeed, his proffered alternative is more a variant on analytical jurisprudence than an alternative to it. Apart from drawing on the dubious virtue of principled consistency, Posner does much to tout the validity of traditional legal scholarship, suitably lifted a theoretical notch or two. Indeed, while there has been a significant increase in the amount of interdisciplinary work done by legal scholars, the fact is that a great deal of that work has been harnessed to the traditional academic task of performing so-called taxonomic scholarship, that is, the classification and organization of legal rules. The performance of this traditional task has become much more sophisticated, but it remains devoted to the same set of jaded goals and ambitions. The ability of mainstream scholarship to absorb and neutralize new insights and fresh perspectives on the study of law is truly staggering. Indeed, its intellectual agility in doing this is to be admired, although it is a great pity that such a prodigious talent cannot be put to more rewarding and less toadying effect. In short, there has been something of a shift from black-letter lawyering, but it has not gone much further than black-letter theorizing. Any significant transformation demands a switch in jurisprudential attention from the pursuit of metaphysical truth, even Posner's watered-down version, to the practice of political usefulness. A juristic account or proposal is mistaken not because it is philosophically wrong, but because it is not practically useful. Unfortunately, for Posner and his ilk, useful is exhausted in the same tired philosophical and apolitical sense. When it comes to thinking about the adjudicative role, most jurists still exist in a semi-conscious state in which the illusions of noble dreams and ignoble nightmares hold sway. The overriding problem, though, is that it's not entirely clear which is the dream and which is the nightmare. The choice between a vision in which judges admit to making law and one in which they claim to be simply applying it is itself dependent on 2 separate considerations: whether it is really possible to apply law without also making it, and whether the law to be applied is substantively superior to what judges might decide it for themselves. Indeed, it is my view that the courts cannot do one without also doing the other. Applying the law involves choice as much as that choice involves reference to existing law. It is a constant and organic interaction between choice and constraint, between amendment and application, and between direction and discretion. In a manner of speaking, judges will never get a good night's sleep, nor should they, as they are destined to struggle with the heavy responsibilities of doing justice. The best that they can hope for is that they will do enough good in their waking hours that they can get sufficient sleep to refresh themselves for the next day's travails. Judges who sleep without dreams or nightmares are either so smugly confident as to question their ability to do justice in a world in which what justice demands is always changing, or so anxiously overwrought as to undermine their capacity to make difficult decisions in difficult circumstances. Doing justice through law, if that is not oxymoronic, and it is not under a pragmatic account, requires judges to concern themselves more with the bracing light of concrete day than the confusing shadows of abstract night. In this regard, Bastaruk is correct. Good judging is about much more than getting the theory right. However, he is wrong in thinking that good judging can be anything more than appreciating that the common law is a work in progress and that the judge's role is to make local and useful contributions to the resolution of the disputes that fall to be decided, bringing it home. In advocating a useful jurisprudence, therefore, I ought not to be taken as championing some fixed or foundational idea of usefulness that is intended to inform and guide practice. On the contrary, I want to ensure that this definitional effort is an integral part of the very argumentative culture that develops and allows transformations of what is and is not useful. Consequently, the emphasis on usefulness is not another disguised strategy of black-letter theorizing in which usefulness replaces integrity or purity as the underlying standard of jurisprudential worth. In moving from truth to usefulness, a pragmatic jurisprudence does not set out to know things as they really are or to isolate a universal criterion of usefulness. Because usefulness is a continually contested and contextualized yardstick, it begs to be judged by its contribution to the ambitious project of challenging the present arrangements in order to improve the future. To do this, jurisprudence requires a different vocabulary more suited to its practical demands. There must be less formal talk of integrity, consistency, and harmony and more substantive talk of justice, well-being, and empowerment. Although, as I have been at pains to emphasize, pragmatism cannot answer the compelling question of what to do next. In any fixed or certain way, it can encourage the jurisprudential effort to ensure that valuable energies are not wasted on pseudo-debates about truth and objectivity. In doing so, it will become possible to open a space in which people can engage directly about what is more and less useful in specific contexts at specific times. In pursuing this useful agenda of jurisprudential study, mainstream theorists still have a possible role to play and a valued contribution to make. A demonstration that any theorist's ethical or political ideals do not flow inexorably from the extant law does not, of course, dispense entirely with their claim on our jurisprudential attention. While it robs these theories of their claimed authority as objective or natural truths, the practical recommendations that they entail must still be judged as one of a series of contingent proposals for making sense of the world and the possibilities for its remaking. Consequently, the work of Dawkins, Posner, and others still has value provided that its insights are treated as rhetorical interventions in a continuing democratic conversation, not as authoritative conversation stoppers regarding eternal verities. Once such jurists ditch their metaphysical baggage, not only might they get to their chosen destination quicker, but they also might accept that, as well as there being several paths to follow, the destination will change as events move on. Dawkins and Posner both should engage in a justificatory dissent that will bring them down to earth so that they will talk more about unemployment, racism, poverty, and the like. If agreement can be reached on the problems to be addressed and their relative priorities, then more time can be spent on their practical resolution than on pseudo-disputes about philosophical niceties. If there is disagreement on the problems or their relative priorities, it will not help much to take time out and argue about abstract notions of truth and objectivity. Even Taming the Bulldog, the natural and the pragmatic. If there was agreement about such speculative matters, it has no necessary consequences for the more crucial and detailed efforts to improve the quality of people's lives. Instead, it is more productive to unpack and identify what is shared and to work to persuade each other how best to go forward as part of what should be a common commitment to improve society. Law is politics, and the more time that is spent on the politics than on resisting this conclusion, the better it will be. Of course, the claim that law is always and inescapably political has profound implications for all lawyers and theorists, as well as undermining the mainstream jurisprudential project and its conceptions of law and lawyering. It obliges critical theorists to take seriously the legal process as a formative constituent of social life and as an important arena for political struggle. This does not mean a lemming-like rush into the courts nor an unconditional embrace of the rule of law. These alternatives are more suited to the born-again jurisprudential zealot than the progressive skeptic. A transformative view of law requires a critical understanding of the political nature of legal structures, their instrumental imitations, and their resistance to accommodate change. Mindful that there is no outside from which to work, there may be occasional strategic advantage in making inside resort to the courts in the struggle to advance social justice. Consequently, the key issues for those devoted to improving the lot of the oppressed and downtrodden are less systemic and more strategic, to determine what substantive changes will best achieve that objective, how those measures can best be implemented, and which institutions can best carry through on that agenda. In efforts to transform law and society, a sensitivity to the contingent possibilities of any particular moment in social history is important. This means that, while those devoted to change would be well advised to disabuse themselves of their habitual resort to the courts as the transformative forum of choice, the possibility of utilizing litigation in the struggle for social justice ought to be kept open. The attempt to make a silk purse of social justice out of the pig's ear of much common law can too easily become a fool's errand. Moreover, litigation is unlikely to do much good on its own because no initiative, legal or otherwise, will work by dint of its intellectual force alone. As celebrated efforts at legal reform such as Brown and Roe show, change is brought about by a concerted series of activist interventions on a broad number of different social fronts. The history of the common law reveals that legal transformations more often follow than lead political change. Homelessness is one of the most pressing problems on the social and political agenda. So debilitating are its deprivations and so pervasive are its consequences that its eradication, or at least its amelioration, is paramount. However, before some possible strategies for change are suggested, it is important to be clear about the characteristics and contours of the problem itself. Too many efforts at reform take a typically grand and unidimensional approach to defining and addressing the problem. Both the traditional right and left seem to view homelessness from a global perspective, albeit entirely different ones. Whereas one understands it as a function of market failures and moral breakdowns, the other sees it as necessary consequence of structural and human deficiencies in capitalism. While each has something to say about the problem and its solution, neither has a monopoly on useful analysis and good sense. The fact is that any workable definition must be multidimensional. It is not so much that definitions of homelessness do not simply objectively describe people's access to dwellings, rather, it is that definitions of homelessness reflect prior political values because any definition rests on particular and controversial goals of social policy. Consequently, homelessness is both a condition and a category. It has both quantitative and qualitative dimensions. In part, this explains why there is so little agreement on the extent of homelessness. Putting numbers to the homeless problem is as difficult as defining it because how it is defined. Is it about having a place to sleep or a place to call home? Temporary relief or permanent remedies? Any housing or reasonable housing? Being on the street or at constant risk of being there? Affects who is counted as homeless. To make matters worse, the very condition of homelessness itself defies most efforts at counting. Moreover, the causes of homelessness are varied and, therefore, efforts at reform must be equally varied. Ironically, diversity has been most successful at penetrating the homeless ranks. There is ample representation from across the racial, gender, age, disabled, and socio-economic spectrums. Accordingly, solutions that might benefit one group, for example, battered women or persons with mental illnesses, will not necessarily help other groups, for example, young people or visible minorities. Given the diverse character of the homeless population and the lack of consensus about the definition, causes, and extent of homelessness, it is hardly surprising that there is no agreement about the solution to the homeless problem. Accordingly, there has to be a combination of short and long-term solutions as well as individualized and structural initiatives that run the gamut from emergency shelters and soup kitchens to guaranteed income policies and public housing projects. In short, because there is no one problem of homelessness, there will also be no one big solution. It will require varied, local, and tailored solutions. This is where the common law can come in. It can provide one possible forum for exploring local and pragmatic solutions to a complex and multifaceted problem. It is tempting to propose a litigation strategy that strives to establish something like a legal right to private property or a constitutional entitlement to adequate housing. However, this seems to be exactly the wrong thing to do for many reasons. Not only does it smack of a big plan, but it also is so unlikely to happen that its advocacy is as much a sign of resignation as a portent of victory. Moreover, as with all such grand proposals, there is a danger that it will turn out to be of more use to the haves than the have-nots. Accordingly, a more local, modest, and immediately useful set of legal maneuvers, constructive trusts, proprietary estoppel, equitable licenses, affirmative tortious duties, unjust enrichment, and so on, seems more conducive to a critically pragmatic perspective and actual success. That having been said, it is important to be clear about what I am and am not asserting about the possible role of the common law in addressing homelessness. As part of the larger project of confirming that law is politics, it is enough to show that the available legal resources are sufficient to support a plausible argument that the common law could respond constructively, if not conclusively, to the plight of the homeless. Such a demonstration does not entail the claim that it is presently an accepted part of the established legal doctrine, that the historical momentum of the common law leads inexorably to such a conclusion, that the deep moral integrity of the common law recommends such initiatives, or even that it will occur. These are all part of the kind of theorizing, whether it is from a soapy-sam quasi-theological stance or a Bulldog pseudo-scientistic approach, that I resist. I defend the much more modest yet still radical idea that such an argument has an intellectual legitimacy and that its acceptance, or rejection, is less about its legal validity and more about its political usefulness. As part of the common law's work in progress, a supportive response to the claims of Homeless is always in the cards, even if it is not yet on the table. In the same way that Holmes insisted that the 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics, it can be reported that the common law in even its constitutional manifestation does not enact Marx's Communist Manifesto, Rawls' A Theory of Justice, or any other ideological program. Moreover, such a doctrinal engagement with the common law will reveal more fully what it means to be against grand theory. I am not so much against theorizing as I am insistent upon the need to resist the traditional tendency to offer the kind of integrated and comprehensive theory that claims universal and first-order significance in directing practical efforts at political improvement. For me, theory is both another form of practice and also, as such, never more than a contextual and contingent response to situated circumstances. In spite of the temptation to defend any particular initiatives as being necessitated by some universal or essential idea of what is progressive or useful, I believe that nothing is lost by refusing to go down that road and that much might be gained. While an argument that the common law must respond constructively to the plight of the homeless in the name of justice would help to win an important battle, it might well lead to a larger defeat in the overall war of social justice. In short, the commitment to such a grand theory of justice is not only impossible to sustain as a theoretical matter, but it might do more practical harm than good in the long run. Too often, the most harmful and immediate suffering has been imposed on people in the cause of a greater yet particularized and historicized claim to absolute truth: fascism, communism, capitalism, colonialism, fundamentalism, and so on. In tackling homelessness, therefore, it is better to be more local and practical in both the scope and implementation of one's ambitions. The test of any positive intervention ought to be its actual success on the ground, not its theoretical consistency in the air. While there might be competing proposals as to what to do next, the critical pragmatist approach will not let the best be the enemy of the good. Being critical, the pragmatist will approach most preferred solutions with skepticism and a certain pessimism. However, being pragmatic, the critic will not let ideological purity or institutional allegiance lead to cynicism or paralysis. Accordingly, I do not maintain that there is only one set of strategic legal proposals or that particular initiatives are more consistent with the kind of pragmatic perspective that I have taken. This would be a negation of the whole critical approach that I have been trying to foster. I simply suggest that lawyers should make a situated assessment of what seems most likely to improve the lot of the homeless. However, if the common law is thought to be an appropriate forum for any remedial action, it is important to recognize that it is also part of the problem. The present conditions that give rise to homelessness are partly held in place and perhaps reinforced by the common law. Indeed, a recognition that the common law is part of the problem also indicates why the common law must be part of the solution. The resort to the common law is as much about doing away with existing doctrines as it is about implementing new doctrinal initiatives. Whatever the problem, the common law is involved. The only real question is, on whose side? Indeed, the common law's apparent indifference to homelessness is a massive part of the problem. By ignoring the problem, it contributes to the social sense that there is no real problem or that, insofar as there is a problem, its causes and cures are outside the common law's ambit of influence and responsibility. Of course, fresh legislative projects are likely more preferable to common law transformation. Land use planning, zoning laws, landlord-tenant statutes, and local taxation are obvious possibilities. Nevertheless, while a lack of legislative will is troubling in itself, it also suggests that common law change will also be difficult. Unless there are sufficient political forces in play, there will be little or no prospect of any improvement. After all, the fact that law is politics means that the limits to law as well the likelihood of shifting them are matters of political moment and not merely legal strategy. The common law is largely hostage to its political context. Indeed, it would be surprising if the common law did not line up itself on the side of the haves. Any other alignment would confound more general expectations about the connection between the common law and existing social interests. Accordingly, the critical task is twofold: to dismantle existing structures that help give rise to the problem of homelessness, and then develop initiatives to make law more constructively useful in overcoming homelessness. Of course, ever mindful that the common law is a work in progress, such interventions should be local, targeted, and pragmatic. The Canadian Aboriginal situation is indicative of both the deep roots of the homelessness problem and the possibility for focused and pragmatic intervention through the common law. Aboriginal people are severely overrepresented and experience more acutely both the personal and structural causes of homelessness. Indeed, the statistics are truly appalling. More than half of Aboriginals reside in dwellings below general housing standards. Many dwellings on reserves lack basic amenities. Aboriginal homes are twice as likely to need major repairs as non-Aboriginal houses and are 90 times more likely to be without a piped water supply. And Aboriginal people are more likely to be tenants than house owners. When all this is combined with the fact that Aboriginal household incomes are % lower than non-Aboriginals, it is a very bleak picture. Few would insist that Aboriginal homelessness is simply a matter of poor housing policy. It is clearly part of a much larger understanding of the plight of Aboriginal people generally. Without an adequate economic, social, and cultural base, the effort to resolve the homelessness problem will be merely stopgap at best and possibly self-defeating. Conversely, by ensuring that there is available and affordable housing, a good foundation will be laid for larger community well-being in the form of improvements in health circumstances, educational betterment, crime reduction, and the like. However, although I am not in any way suggesting that it is the only or best way to proceed, Aboriginal people have had some success in pursuing various land-related claims in common law courts. Largely closed out of the political arena, lawyers have been able to make arguments to judges that there is Aboriginal title to customary lands that, while different in kind to traditional non-Aboriginal proprietary rights, provides a similar level of common law protection. Aboriginal title is a legal right derived from the Indians' historic occupation and possession of their tribal lands. The history of this struggle for recognition showcases the strengths and weaknesses of the common law as a work in progress that develops and fits and starts as it responds to changing social expectations and political forces. Conclusion. As with much else, the relation between biology and human behavior, including theories about their relationship, is likely to be variable, complex, and indirect. In an important sense, this tension in law constitutes one more corner of the action in the familiar battle between nature and nurture. It is hard to believe that this can be conceived of as an either-or choice. It is surely much more likely that it is a mix of both that occurs in a contingent and intricate way. Accordingly, although it might be tempting to dismiss all law and biology positions as vulgarly reductionist or crassly essentialist, it would be mistaken. While law's development cannot be reduced to a simple evolutionary dynamic, this does not mean that there are no evolutionary forces at work. The role of evolutionary factors will be appropriately contingent and changeable. Evolution has no goal. There are directional trends of a lesser kind, but they are not overarching and they can end as abruptly as they began. Viewed in this way, both the Dawkins and Posners of the jurisprudential world can be understood as being both right and wrong. They are right because their accounts do offer large and useful insights into how the law is viewed, created, and changed. They each have something to tell us about the dynamics of legal change and judicial reasoning. The common law is both principled and pragmatic, ideal and instrumental, and thematic and discontinuous. They are wrong because they treat those helpful insights as universal sagacity about the nature of law and adjudication. Consequently, to the extent that law and economics and law and biology accounts avoid totalizing claims and steer clear of Hume's chasm, they might be useful projects that can divulge much about legal development and change. However, when so understood, they cease to be the kind of foundationalist theories that both Dawkins and Posner offer. Instead, they become the kind of critical projects that respect, even when they do not follow or produce, what my critically pragmatic perspective suggests. In exploring the world of evolutionary theory and studying its applicability to the common law, I might be considered to have been long on theoretical critique and short on practical illustration. Indeed, for an approach that prides itself on the importance of elevating political insight over intellectual coherence, this might seem to be a serious and perhaps fatal error. At best, it seems to be a rather useless account in the critically pragmatic sense that I have been defending. Accordingly, in the next chapter, and other later ones, I redirect my efforts and concentrate on giving a more concrete and less abstruse account of how the common law might be viewed in line with the critique that I have elaborated up to this point. This is a heavy burden, but the task is one that I believe can be satisfactorily achieved. The history of the common law is a rich and fertile source from which to mine the necessary raw materials to substantiate and reinforce the larger claims that I have made. Being a work in progress, the common law is revealed through its historical record, its present performance, and its future promise as the kind of institutional device that not only helps to hold in place the status quo but that might also offer possibilities to bring about substantial changes to it.